Good afternoon. This is Jake Lapp, Compliance Team Lead at ECFA. It's my privilege to welcome you to today's special ECFA webinar on managing a remote team securely and effectively. With the recent pandemic, many organizations were forced into allowing employees to work remotely, presenting not just a variety of logistical challenges, but also security challenges. We're excited to offer this webinar to our members and friends in hopes that it helps as you navigate the world of remote work. Our special guest presenter today is Thomas Tyler, Cybersecurity Advisor at Cape & Krause. We're thankful for Thomas's expertise on this subject. Before we continue much further, let us open our time in a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you today for the opportunity to gather on this webinar. We're thankful for each ECFA member and friend who has taken time to join us today for this important topic. Lord, we are grateful for the opportunity to minister in these times and for your faithfulness to us each day. We pray a special blessing on Thomas as he shares today and for each church and ministry represented on this webinar. Please give us wisdom to navigate these important issues of working remotely and helping us as we all continue to model integrity and glorify you in all that we do. In Jesus' name, amen. And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Thomas Tyler for his presentation on managing a remote team securely and effectively. Thomas, take it away.
Thanks, Jake. I appreciate the intro there. And like he said, with the pandemic that we've been going through for the past year to, maybe 14 months or so, a lot of our organizations were forced into things we may not necessarily have been prepared for. And while we long for the day when we see employees and our colleagues back in offices again, some of them may end up being remote for the foreseeable future. And to be honest with you, some organizations may find themselves, just embracing this type of flexibility because of all of the different added benefits that it has. So today we're going to touch on that a little bit, go into some background surrounding remote work, and discuss some of the risks or concerns that you may face when you're trying to continue, navigating this in the current environment. Next slide, please. So, it's fairly interesting to think about how much our lives have changed in the past year. I think we've all grown more accustomed than we would have originally thought to accomplishing tasks in our personal and business lives in a different manner. Being on a virtual webinar like this is one of the repercussions from what we've had to deal with. And we hold these virtual meetings and we have dinner and groceries delivered, and we can't travel anywhere right now. And let's hope that none of us, if you've had the virus, you've recovered successfully. But needless to say, things are very different, and they will continue to be different for a while going forward. Next slide. Jump back to where you were just 12 or 14 months ago when you were planning for 2020. I'm fairly certain that when you were bringing your different stakeholders to get together to discuss what your year was going to look like, and different things you wanted to take care of, the global pandemic and COVID-19 were not part of these topics. Overall, we had to take a step back from any plans that we wanted to implement this year or different things and deal with the current situational issues. And it was important to make our businesses safe for our employees and customers. And this is where we are now. We really don't necessarily have to be dressed for success to be successful. I'd love to take a polling question of how many people aren't wearing formal clothes right now and have embraced the sweatpants and workout athleisure lifestyle. But to be honest with you, this idea of cloud collaboration, not only has it become more important than it had been previously pre-pandemic, but it really was starting to become the norm for a lot of people. Back in 2018, about 5% of the workforce was working from home, and in 2019, that kind of rose to 15%. And that's changed somewhat with, to say the least, with the pandemic going on. To give you some background, for our small firm in particular, we've been around for over 20 years doing auditing and consulting work for IT and IS environments. And about 10 years ago or so, we completely got rid of our office because we found we didn't need it anymore. All of our employees were working remotely, and we could accomplish the same or more work from just working from our houses. Next slide. So this whole idea of remote work is not a new idea, and companies have been attempting to put it into place for decades. So it really is something we've been working on for a while now, but it just has different new iterations, or the types of tools you have to implement this has changed. Today, it's easier more than ever to collaborate in an office and remotely, and with the attempt to this, it kind of gave rise to working from home. All of this new technology we have, especially since it started, back in the 1980s with the rise in the personal computer, was promising, a shortened commute. Telecommuting was the big buzzword back then, where you could look at your talent pool from a broader perspective and not necessarily focus on a specific area of your state or country. So the whole idea behind this was that it was going to be beneficial for employees and executives and whoever to be able to work in this manner. Next slide. There was some really awesome technology to do this too. Check out this Palm Top PC that was released as part of the Atari portfolio in June of 1989. Lets you do all of your work remotely. And I'm sure this wasn't light to carry around, and it was probably seen more as a novelty versus an exception. And speaking personally, I remember the days when you would go in a coffee shop and there'd be more people, maybe reading a book or a magazine versus on a laptop. And nowadays, you pretty much anywhere you go, there's going to be somebody working on a computer or connected to the internet in some way. We could give countless examples of this type of mobile technology, and the devices like these gave rise to the laptops we know and use today, Palm Pilots, Blackberries, and then finally to the modern smartphone. So today we are 1,000 times better situated to accomplish the daily tasks we need with the devices we have at our disposal. Next slide. So the history of remote work has not always been positive. It's been strewn with failure after failure, and it's been a discussion for years on whether or not it's worth it for companies to follow through with these types of plans. IBM specifically had almost half of its workforce remote in 2009 and called a bunch of people back into the office in 2017. And a lot of these companies have tried, the idea of remote work and pulled back on it. Next slide. In recent years, I'm sure you've seen the news articles about how lavish these corporate campuses are out in California and the Pacific Northwest. And you can get back to the picture in a second after you answer the polling question. But with a lot of these campuses, these companies have spent billions trying to entice employees to come work for them, and offering free perks like free food and massages and gym memberships and all of this stuff just to get the employees to come and work for those companies. This all trickles down to other companies and other organizations that are trying to get the best and brightest to come work for them as well. And it's really hard to compete with things like this when you're trying to gain employees in this manner. And because of this virus, I think it is fair to say that our outlook on the way we work and the way we approach our business life has changed drastically. It's causing effects worldwide, and it's sometimes, and in most instances, what's kind of interesting to look at is that it's pulling the future forward. In just a relatively short period of time, there have been numerous far-reaching changes across almost every single industry and business. Traditional methods and services offered to customers and clients have been upended, and there's new and possibly unproven methods being implemented that could be occurring sometimes hastily. As a whole, across every type of business, it's acted mainly as a hyper accelerant, and it's reshaping different aspects of our business lives for what we're going to see going forward. And I wanted to touch on a few of these real fast before we get into more of the discussion on the security concerns behind remote work. But a few of the big things we've seen over the past year are just changes in retail. There's a surge in online shopping and delivery where the big players with good infrastructure for delivery like Amazon and Walmart and Target are just posting record figures, where brick and mortar retailers or your typical mall retailers are really scrambling to adapt. And a lot of these companies are trying to put into place strategies or transition using a process that would normally take years to implement. Next slide. Education is another thing that we've seen drastic changes in. You know, if you have any kids at home that are, or if your grandparents, any children that are in school, you know that they've had to change the way that they've adapted. You know, I read an article recently that stated, you know, there's however many school systems there are in the country, there's that many different ways for how they're approaching or how they're reacting to the pandemic. So it's become the norm for kids to interact with their fellow peers over the computer like this. And I'm sure, you know, it'll be a while until we understand the implications of this and the positive and negative effects that this has had on our kids. Next slide. And of course, you know, drastic changes were seen across all work environments. Offices looked like this a few years ago with open environments, no dividers of plexiglass and no taped off chairs or social distancing signs or things like that. And you can also see, like, even within this picture specifically, there's a lot of desktop computers there. And I don't know that any of us are going to be approaching a purchase like that in the same way going forward. You know, specifically to something like this, organizations fell across, you know, just a different spectrum of preparedness. You know, every single type of organization out there had some level of expertise or awareness and how this could work, but you know, they really kind of had to have their feet put to the fire to move forward and bring into play all of these different changes that erupted. Next slide. So yeah, back, you know, about a year ago now, there really was an unprecedented shift. Everything was closing down. We had to shelter in place. There were over 60% of Americans that were reported as working from home in April of 2020. Now, remember, that number was about 15% in 2019. So it's crazy to see what a change that can have over just a 12-month period like that. And then as part of one survey, almost 3/4 of CEOs of large companies expected some type of permanent shift to remote work post pandemic. So it's something that's definitely not going away. For a lot of people, though, they haven't been, you know, working from home, but more at home trying to work. And this was typical for a lot of people at the time, and may still be to some extent. You know, I remember last April specifically because young children at home, and my wife and I were just trying to make it work and try to get what we needed to get done. And she was up till 11, 12 o'clock at night trying to do things for her job that she typically would have been able to do for the day. And so you just added on to your typical workload where you're now having to manage daycare. Maybe you have to take people to the doctor. You're cooking all the meals at home. You've lost any benefit of outside caretakers like grandparents or babysitters or things like that. And then you're trying to balance all this with the realities of a pandemic, which no one had really been through before. You can't see your friends or your extended family. You can't go eat at your favorite restaurant. The vacation you were planning has been canceled. So it's been difficult for everybody. And not only was it difficult, you know, for employees, but the managers of the employees were also having trouble because everybody's in the same boat, but they're trying to make sure that the work is being done and that they're being effective as supervisors or managers, and they're running into walls trying to maintain that type of effectiveness. With all these changes too, we're seeing that there's a change in workforce demands. You know, there's different types of emerging jobs out there where there's an inherent need to meet the demand of different work environments. And we're really kind of experiencing a mobility boom, you know, with how employees can now operate autonomously away from the office. I've spoken with colleagues in other businesses, and the response by upper management or partners just falls across a variety of viewpoints. Some have fully embraced remote work, while others don't understand how someone can accomplish what they need to get done from another state. So as leaders within our organizations, we have to navigate these changes and adapt the roles we may have had in place for our workforce. And expanding these roles helps our organizations keep up with the current landscape and kind of manage you know, our member needs or our donor needs. And if we're honest, you know, I don't think anyone was completely prepared for what started to happen back in March. Hopefully you were somewhat prepared because of your overall strategy, but I think as I think as an organization, we have to realize that this type of culture just kind of starts at the top. You have to have forward-thinking management and executives who understand how to approach a problem with the solution that'll benefit the organization, and they can be adaptable to changes, especially when they were occurring as fast as what we had previously seen. To go over a few things that we've seen where employees are basically just trying to get the work done. Most of the time, this type of working was not traditional. You probably have had employees that you may have worked with in your organization that did the same type of job at the same desk in the same office with the same colleagues for years. They had a structured schedule to get things done, and they knew how to do them. But suddenly, they've been thrown into something different. And not only that, but the people who were supervising them or managing them didn't know how to perform that role in a remote work environment. Coming home and sending everybody home presented new challenges. They may have had to get set up with certain access to your system, or maybe they needed a new computer. Maybe even the internet was slow and it wasn't capable of supporting their needs. I'm sure all of us have been on different types of virtual calls or video meetings, and we know there's always that one person who has the lack of bandwidth on their internet connection because they cut out and their video's bad and all of that. And that can be an issue, especially when you're trying to get stuff done and accomplish things in a timely manner. Also, we may have experienced the need to cross-train our employees better. Again, with all of these employees who've been doing the same thing over and over again, having a backup to what they do could be important, especially, if they do get sick and they can't interact with the employees they used to or perform their daily duties. And not only is that complicated, but you also have to ensure that their access is appropriately restricted, as well as whoever the backup is. So if someone gets pulled into accounting and they've never had access to a specific type of system, access to a certain file, you have to manage that and how that needs to be appropriately segregated. Last but certainly not least, with this idea of trying to get the work done is the added data security issue. And a lot of times this kind of gets pushed by the wayside as an afterthought. But to be honest with you, depending on the number of employees you've had, you just expanded your computer network from 1 or 2 main locations to maybe 25 or 50 different networks, because everybody's at home. And we're going to go into detail more on how those employees can stay secure at home later, but there's just so many added security implications when you bring a work device home to a personal network. I hate the idea that people, this is their first experience with remote work, because a lot of people are going to be turned off by the idea of it. They're not going to think that it necessarily works the way it should. But it's important to be flexible in this area, and for managers and employees to understand that working from home works well when it's implemented in the right way, not when it's implemented in a hasty way. Technology, processes, and the culture of the organization needs to be considered. And not only is the technology important, but you may have found that maybe some of the different processes or maybe even some policies you got in place for years are either outdated or unnecessary. So it's important to look at those and ensure that these types of distributed employees can participate in them easily. One of the examples I heard a while back was that there was a process in place that required a physical signature of 2 partners at an organization. Is that really necessary when something can be electronically signed in this day and age? And it's up to each organization to look at those different processes and determine their risk profile and how they want to approach it. But there's little things like that that people really need to take into account and understand how that process might work. Lastly, your business culture should be adequately reflected across the organization. Ensuring these outdated ideals are pushed to the wayside for new mindsets to grow can be really helpful. You don't want to be the last person or the only person in the room who refuses to adapt to change. No one really at the organization is immune to this. Everyone from the top down must be on the same page, and the guidance needs to be provided by this management of the organization to the entire team, no matter where they operate. One of the tactics we've taken as a remote environment, as a fully remote company, is we had the issue of how do we ensure that employees maintain the same business results but balance their personal needs. And this is a big thing nowadays in regards to work-life balance and making sure that you are working appropriately, but you're still taking time off for yourself. This is where this idea of a results-only work environment comes into play. The idea is just basically to delegate tasks accordingly and not to micromanage employees. I don't think, I know specifically I don't want to micromanage anybody, but it's important to think through those things like that. Simply telling managers to trust their employees is going to be unlikely to be sufficient, but they need to learn new skills of delegation and really empowerment to provide their workers with the ability to have greater autonomy over their work methods and the timing of their work. If you have something that has to get done, make it a task for that week and make sure that it gets done by then. It doesn't matter if the employee does it at 10 a.m. on a Monday or at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. If it needs to be done by Friday, it gets done. Work really should no longer be tied to time productivity. And it's really helpful for employees and especially managers to understand that. And again, it goes back to that idea of educating everybody that when this type of system is designed appropriately and with the best thought process in place, it's more productive than office working. The existing research shows that, the benefits arise because of the greater autonomy that's afforded to remote workers. But, if the autonomy is low and there's high micromanagement because of what could be considered managerial mistrust or anything like that, where employees aren't given the benefit of the doubt, the benefits of remote work are unlikely to rise. Employees really need appropriate tools and technology to be effective. And without a good understanding of how the different products or services that you might have already work together, organizations who are attempting to set up reliable remote work infrastructure may often implement ineffective tools and applications that don't work together. When you have distributed applications or devices on different platforms, that can really stall productivity. It can increase frustrated and stressed employees. And, a lot of that's on a good day. Bad implementation of these tools can be a real hindrance and can really affect security as well coming down the line. And we will discuss that in a little bit. Across this idea of collaboration with your own employees, the idea of communication is paramount. It becomes a key thing that you have to consider when you're looking at this. At first, you might think it might be more communication than necessary. A lot of times it becomes second nature with the different methods that you have at your disposal, and it can become less intrusive. It's really, a lot of us will receive emails and feel like we have to respond to them immediately. Sometimes they are timely, but most of the time they're not. You can delegate them or follow your own personal email rules for how those are sorted. But a lot of times, if you do have the ability to chat with a coworker, you can respond quickly to say, hey, look, I got your email. I can't respond right now, but I will look at it within the next 4 hours and get back with you. It could be because you're driving, might be picking up the kids or going to the grocery store, but acknowledging that and moving forward is helpful for your employees, and it makes sure that they know that everybody's on the same page. Another thing that also becomes an issue that we've had to actually deal with some of our employees is this idea of isolation. It actually can become a valid issue and a possible complaint because there's no outlet for small talk or casual interchanges with other employees. The typical water cooler meeting or talk in the lunchroom is gone now. And with that lack of casual interchanges, it's important for these employees to interact with each other or interact with other people in their lives. Whether that's to pick up a cup of coffee or anything like that. And it's effective to have methods in place, or at least for employees to understand that they need to be mindful of that and to take care of themselves in their own way. It's imperative here that employees work in concert with each other for the effective and efficient work environment you've come to know. And so there's these different types of collaboration platforms that are helpful and beneficial tools across a hybrid and distributed office environment. These are some of the ones that are out there today, and they actually are very useful. You know, today we're using GoToWebinar, which is a product of GoToMeeting. I'm sure many of us have been on these types of virtual calls or Zoom calls. Microsoft Teams is listed there, Google Hangouts. A lot of different platforms are out there that really provide good benefits to organizations. One of the things that we implemented internally at Cape and Krause as a whole over the last, I'd say 18 months or so, was Microsoft Teams, because you know, we utilized Microsoft Office 365 and it was, you know, free for us to use. And we really loved the use of Teams. And there really are a lot of platforms out there. I've just picked a few here that I've worked with specifically, and some other good ones that have received good reviews. Like I said, there is an overwhelming number of choices. And usually what you'll find, especially now, is that employees must utilize a variety of these for internal and external discussion with each other. So if you go look at your laptop now, you've probably got 3 or 4 different video conferencing apps now installed, at least. And so all of those different application usage requirements or needs based on the people you're interacting with can be overwhelming and can be confusing at times. So the complexity here grows as your employees start to utilize products that, you know, different types of stakeholders might use to interact with them. Specifically, you know, there's strengths and weaknesses to each application, and I think it's going to be true for any type of organization that uses more than one platform. It's important to recognize and approach them in a practical manner to ensure the best use case for your users. I'd say most of them are probably going to have to use different platforms, and it really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So just kind of establishing some guidelines for your users helps them be aware of when they can use certain platforms for certain things. I'll go back to the Teams example real fast. You know, we use that mainly right now for internal communication with our, you know, different audit teams or leaders or things like that. And what's really been beneficial about Microsoft Teams is the fact that you can really cut down on the email that you get, especially if you do a lot of collaboration with other employees or groups within your organization or even other organizations. It's not just, you know, restricted to internal use. You can use it externally as well. But I know that we've probably all been on email chains that we've received where there might be 3 or 4 main people emailed with some people CC, maybe a BCC, and there's a lot of different input that goes on with these different email chains. There's different questions that only 1 or 2 people might supposed to be answering. Some other people might chime in with different details or ideas. Some people may be responding to an older version of the email, so they haven't gotten the latest version with the latest updates. Teams, in this type of collaboration with your own groups, help mitigate issues you see with that, and it helps go from a huge email tree like that to something that's more concise. You know, you can outline specific questions and tag users that need to answer them, and those can be answered in line with the question, and they don't have to be broken out to a different chat box. It's really interesting to see how you can take little things like that that are daunting and are hard to manage and make them more concise and easier to understand. All this being said, you know, with all of the different changes we've had to our working environments over the past year, the concerns that we might have had previously or may not have had, depending on your organization, around information security and information technology management, it may have grown as we added more complexity with any new software we had to implement, or, you know, with the employees working from home. So this really shows that we need to make sure our organizations are being as secure as they can be. In 2020, the average total cost of a data breach was just under $4 million per breach globally. The country with the highest average cost was the United States at $8.6 million per breach. The study here also found that some small organizations typically had a significantly higher average cost per employee and were also more at risk of not recovering from a breach than a larger organization. Like back in 2020, the average cost per lost record was $146. But while this may not seem like a lot, you have to consider how many records your organization may have or may have access to, like for donors or members or anything like other constituents or stakeholders. With a breach of 1,000 records, that's 146K. But if you extrapolate that to 5,000, we're over $750,000 or so. So there's a lot of data within an organization, and the cost of a breach can really quickly reach a significant level. And we have to remember that even though with these cyber attacks that we see on an almost daily basis now, they didn't really take a back seat while we're all trying to deal with the pandemic. In fact, cyber criminals typically use current environments like that to their advantage. And they are really able to exploit people easier when they're trying to raise money for a recent disaster or tie their attack to something related to a pandemic. A very common theme across a lot of these different types of security breaches that we see are lack of security within online applications and issues with your third-party vendors. And it's important to discuss how we can address these issues. Next slide. This really isn't all bad news, though, because what you do identify from a lot of these things are that a lot of the added cost to what you could do to reduce your risk isn't going to be that much. Now, obviously, there are things that you could put into place that could cost a lot of money. But I'm here to tell you that there's a lot of controls that you could easily turn on or implement within your organization that are going to essentially raise you out of being that low-hanging fruit and help make sure that you're not the guy that's getting exploited because of clicking a link in an email or something. So there's numerous security concerns surrounding this, but again, a lot of these you can really do yourself, or you can have maybe your outsourced IT provider do for you. They really kind of get broken out into three different types of concerns. The first one actually is in regards to third-party vendors. And when you look at a vendor like this, it could be anybody from an outsourced technology provider to your accounting platform host or anybody like that, where you're providing them with access to your resources, or they have access to your personal data for not only your employees but also members or constituents. So typically, when you have a vendor process like this, you break it out when you're first engaging with a vendor. So you'd go through with any new vendor and perform different oversight procedures or risk assessments, and maybe internally you have some approval processes or signatures you need to make sure that that vendor is the vendor you want to go with. With existing vendor relationships, you may have stuff that you may have vendors you utilize for a lot of these areas, and a lot of these can offer you help and support, but it's also good to perform the different types of review procedures for these vendors on an ongoing basis. So again, not only would this include types of IT support or managed service providers, but again, it's going to include your accounting platforms or maybe customer or donor management systems or things like that. Another thing that's helpful to get with these vendors on is to ensure that they're performing adequate reviews of your data and making sure that they're doing audit reports on themselves and things like that. So that being said, in regards to these different vendor concerns, I would imagine that if you did implement a vendor in the last year, it might have been done hastily, and there may not have been the time to perform the necessary due diligence required to formally vet a vendor. There's some things you could go back and do now if you're concerned with that. One of the biggest things you can do is just request their security audit report, or what's known as a SOC report. A lot of these hosted vendors that have your data hosted for you or have access to your data have to complete these on a periodic basis. And reviewing those gives you kind of a baseline idea of how they're doing and if there's any glaring concerns you need to be aware of. You can go back and review your contracts again and make sure that you agreed, you know what you've signed off on, and that you're both in agreement on when the contract will be up for renewal and any price increases or anything like that. One of the biggest things that I think has been helpful for a lot of people, that may have had a system they put in place rather hastily would be just to go back and research what others have implemented. Different hardening or securing controls that you can turn on for a lot of these systems can be really helpful. Sometimes they don't come like that by default, so it is important to go back and turn those types of things on. Just a quick Google search, might lead you to an online forum or a place where there might be IT people talking about the way they implemented something or the mistakes they made when they implemented something. So that really helps you when you're looking at your own applications. In short, whatever controls you have in place, your vendor needs to have better controls. You're paying them a lot of money probably, and they should have good and decent controls in place to help protect your data. I always like to use the example when we're speaking to people about this. It's Amazon Web Services typically has the resources to provide better security than your main server closet in the back of your office building. So, with a lot of the changes we made or outsourced providers that we're now utilizing, there are still some responsibilities that you as an organization have to recognize are handled internally. And this allows you to make sure that you're providing adequate security for your end users internally, but also for access to different types of systems. One of the best things you can do is ensure that all of your devices are managed. And devices is a rather loosely used term here because it can really mean any type of device on your network. So we're not only looking at your laptops and desktops and your smartphones, but also tablets, printers, copy machines, any Internet of Things devices, anything like this needs to be managed in some way. The best thing you could have would be a centralized system where it's very helpful to have in place because you can easily see at a glance if there's anything that's not getting a security update or hasn't received the latest operating system update or maybe antivirus software or things like that. You can easily remediate issues. A lot of times for smaller organizations, I would say, under 20 devices or so, a manual process can be effective because you can rely on your end users to patch the devices. That can be helpful now, especially if you have a lot of devices that have been farmed out to employees that are now working from home. So having that in place, or it can be as simple as just establishing a good process for employees to check that their devices are patched, or maybe they have to report in or email someone that they've done it. Anything like that could be really helpful to help ensure that they are completing that in a timely manner. It's also helpful on these devices to limit access to certain things, like being able to share between devices or add new applications, or maybe browser add-ons between Chrome or Firefox or things like that. It's also helpful when you're explaining the nuances of this to your employees, is that in regards to their personal devices, if they are operating from home now, the devices that are on their home network should be updated accordingly. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we have a network. We're across the board with a lot of different people working from home, and all of these devices need to be updated appropriately. If you haven't established one already, establishing an acceptable use policy for these devices can be helpful. It ensures that the employee and the organization are on the same page with what's required for you. Next slide. Mobile devices are inherently mini computers now. We carry them around in our pockets, so they need to have the same types of security in place for these as a computer would. Again, having that acceptable use policy, enforcing restrictions like having employees use passwords or biometric authentication. The devices should be encrypted. You should have the ability to remote wipe them. All of those types of things are important for the mobile device management. And with a lot of these devices, you can actually utilize a centralized system to manage these as well. So considering use of a mobile device management software can be helpful. Establishing procedures for how data is removed from devices, such as if a lost or stolen, or if the device is passed on to a new user. All of those types of things can be helpful for management of your mobile devices. And ensuring that they're appropriately restricted is important as well, because you don't want any pertinent or personal information or data to be transferred between different cloud service providers across the devices. It can be really confusing sometimes when you think you're saving something locally or to your organization's cloud service provider, and it ends up in your personal iCloud account. For the Internet of Things devices, and you kind of touched on this already, but again, this is really anything that can connect to the internet. So not only the typical devices you'll use for internet access, but also the document reproduction technology, your streaming devices, smart speakers, all of this type of stuff needs to be updated and patched accordingly. And now we have to kind of expand that to include our home networks as well. In regards to password security, we could have an entire discussion on what's a good password and how we store them and how we manage them and all of these types of things. But really here with passwords and access to systems, layered security is key. Using a complex password that's a certain established length with different numbers, characters, and symbols can be helpful. You don't want to use your kids' names or your pets' names or things like that, and change them, when they're compromised. You'd be surprised how many people out there just leave the same password for access, even though they know that a type of system has been compromised. Just adding a few extra characters to your password can make it much harder for a software or a hacker to crack the password. And using unique and private passwords makes it much easier to manage security. So you don't want to commingle business and personal passwords. You can use a password manager, but you don't necessarily want to have a less stringent password requirement for gaining access to that. Really, the idea here is having different types of layers of security. So ensuring that whatever you're doing has different features built in, like a biometric authentication, your Touch ID, your Face ID, or things like that, where you use your fingerprint or your face to get in. Setting an account lockout. If there's an activity, the account locks out, or you're automatically logged out, or things like that can be really helpful. One of the best things that you can do is in regards to multi-factor authentication. And that's critical for any type of cloud application, from remote access capabilities to just your basic email or gaining access to your IT services online. Really, this is where you're utilizing a mobile device to receive a text message or an email message, or maybe you have an authentication app to provide that third factor of authentication outside of just your user ID and password. If there's one thing you could learn from today's webinar, it's to go and turn all of this on for anything that has the capability to do it. Not only within your business life, but also in your personal life. If you've got a personal Gmail account, or you use Amazon or Facebook or any of these websites, they all support this. Go turn it on. You're gonna raise yourself out of that low-hanging fruit to be less likely to be hacked. I think we're getting kind of short on time, so I did want to leave some time for questions, so we might kind of go through some of these other ones pretty fast. But in regards to encryption, data sent and received in transit and at rest should be protected. Encryption should be enabled across your devices. User provisioning and access provides an established guideline for like a minimum rights for your users, setting them for different types of new employees, or if there's an internal transfer or things like that. You're basically just saying this is what so-and-so in this job role would need when they start working for us, or what are we going to do if we have a terminated employee, or somebody retires, or maybe they go on extended leave, or they become a contractor. You can take all of that into account, and then you want to review these regularly. Looking at the different access lists you have and comparing them to just a current employee list can be really helpful. In regards to remote access tools, there's a lot of different methods out there that we're using now to gain access to different systems or provide secure access to organization resources. With our increased end users, this is going to require proper security measures that really move out of the quick of different items and into a long-term, because this type of thing is going to affect our strategic planning. We want to make sure, if something like this does happen in the future where we need to give remote access or continue the use of remote access, that we're doing so in a proper manner, and we're planning for that. So whatever you keep in place here after you've implemented, you want to make sure it's secured appropriately. Using any type of outdated remote access methods can really open you up to heightened security issues. So if you have this turned on, it's important to make sure that whatever you've done is locked down appropriately, and it wasn't just taking a quick fix and utilizing it for the near future. In regards to Wi-Fi, using properly secured Wi-Fi is very important, at work and at home, since we're all at home now. There's a bunch of different methods you can utilize to provide secure access, mainly not really using public Wi-Fi unless you're secured with a proper connection like a VPN. At home, you can encrypt your network appropriately. You may want to use a guest network for non-business systems, but definitely have a secure password for access, not only to gain access to your Wi-Fi, but also in regards to the admin settings on your router. A few more things to go through real fast. If you have applications that you have hosted online, a lot of them might have an API in place, which is an application programming interface. This mainly allows other applications to communicate with each other on the back end to enhance functionality. If you're not using these, or you don't think that you need them for some reason, you can restrict these access areas and just turn them off, and it can really reduce the risk because of the different types of elevated privileges that these APIs have. In regards to data retention, you want to make sure that your policy or any procedures you have reflect where the data you need to keep. So going through and establishing and evaluating the data you have and removing anything you don't need can be really helpful, and it really helps lower your risk of what could be exploited. Shadow IT is really interesting concept to read about because a lot of what is behind this are employees basically just trying to do their jobs more efficiently. I know it sounds pretty nefarious here, but it's really just applications or devices that are utilized without your IT support provider or internal IT's knowledge. This could be like rogue cloud services or maybe devices that weren't approved for use or things like that. I could see a lot of this happening if people went home and their home computer was faster than their work computer, so they started using the home computer, or maybe they wanted to use a tablet to take notes and that wasn't part of the organization's resources. There's a lot of things like that that could be in place that you may not know about. So having appropriate authorization procedures for locking any types of devices or services like that down can be really helpful. One of the last takeaways to go over is in regards to basically the end user controls. And this is one of the most important things you can do because it helps your end users understand the implication behind these threats. An easy way to do this is with employee training. Nowadays, that'll be through webinar. And I know we've done a lot of those lately for clients that have been really helpful for them because it's quick, it's easy, it's something where employees can understand the different policies or procedures they have, but and go through all of the different things we've talked about today. But it really helps build a culture of awareness because you have employees that are understanding of what's going on with the organization and why the security controls are so necessary. So some takeaways to consider here, there's definitely threats that are out there that weren't on our radar 12 months ago. We want to make sure that we're staying as secure as possible. And if we are hacked in some way, that loss of reputation can be significant. So ensuring that you have adequate security controls in place provides critical tools for your users. And like I said, it can just be settings that you just turn on or have an idea for a plan that really don't have to be expensive. Technology here is really what's driving the entire idea of remote work. Without these applications of technology, it would really be next to impossible to get anything done. So we need to consider this for future planning and decisions that will determine, if we're going to start just buying laptops from now on, or what type of policies we have to change or implement for ensuring success in a remote work environment. It's going to require a shift in mindset from our different types of traditional management techniques and even mentoring techniques. As I said earlier, the culture here starts at the top. You really can't manage what you can't measure, so ensuring that you're trying to push towards a results-only work environment if you can be really helpful. You know, in regards to this, one size is not going to fit all, but and not everybody may be successful at that. It's going to take some work to make sure that the process you want to put in place is going to work correctly. At the end of the day, though, remote work is not just a tactical move, but that one that saves money. But additional savings can be realized because it's a strategic move. It mainly just comes down to trust. Trusting your people is what makes this thing work. And just because you've implemented all of these different tools that allow the idea of remote work, it doesn't have to mean that in-person collaboration or discussion can't occur. It just helps you build the bonds that make the remote collaboration richer. So being flexible here is really a helpful thing that you can put in place, and ensuring that you have good people that you trust and that will get the job done is what's really going to make that work for you. So I think it's time for some questions. I didn't see anything come through the chat, I don't think, but if Jake, if you've got something you've seen, I am happy to dive in and answer some questions.
All right, Thomas, that was great. A lot of helpful information on a topic that I know you just can't really get away from at this point. I know on my own news feed on my phone, every time I open it, there's always something about, will the office come back? Is remote work here to stay? How do I engage my staff? So I'm sure this has been a huge benefit for those that are listening now or listen to it later on demand. We have had a few questions come in, so if you still have questions, send them over to webinar@ecfa.org. One question that we have here is, our office teams currently working remotely, as a lot of offices, of course, are. And it's kind of a technical question, but I think it's probably one that people are struggling with. We receive credit card donations, work hard to maintain PCI compliance, but it's been more challenging because of the phone and internet networking factors, with staff needing to work remotely. It's not necessarily set up for a VPN. So what are some other options that ministries like that can look at, especially when it comes to donation processing remotely?
Yeah, so essentially with that type of information, you don't want to take confidential information like a credit card number, things like that, through unsecured email. Having a processor, like a third-party processor in place to manage that for you, is really helpful. But with that comes the implications, again, of that third-party vendor. So that would be one of those critical vendors you would want to perform vendor due diligence on. And that would involve looking at their security audit reports, ensuring their PCI compliance, things of that nature. And it's definitely a moving target there. But most of the time, the thing you don't want to do is accept that type of information in an unsecured manner, like an email or things like that. I know that can be daunting for a lot of people, because you might receive something from a donor through an email. You have to kind of remind them, look, you don't want to do it this way. Your information could be compromised at some point. So let's hop on a phone call and take it that way, or maybe we push them to utilize that online service provider.
Oh, that's great. Well, here's another one. Maybe this is something that you can look at differently, but would it be possible to get any sample acceptable use or bring your own device type policies? Is anything like that available?
I think we do have some of that type of information available. Okay. If you want, if somebody's looking for that specifically, you can email me at my email address there, and we can look into providing that for you.
Great. Well, you may have just opened up the floodgates to your email on that one. Here's another one here. With all of the different platforms that you discussed, there's free platforms versus paid platforms. How do you assess those, and which direction is securely the best way to go for ministries?
Well, and that's an important question to have internally, I think, because with a lot of free platforms out there, they're mainly trying to entice you to get in and pay for their service. But what we found is, with a lot of free platforms, they may not have the same security controls in place that they would provide if you're doing a paid platform. And they're not going to make that unknown to you. But it is something to look into. Like I know the classic example is of Dropbox. the free version of Dropbox did not, and I'm not sure if it's still like this, but for the longest time, they didn't have the same security controls in it as the paid or business version of Dropbox did. So that's one of those things to definitely consider when you're looking at comparing different vendors. And again, that goes back to that vendor review process and making sure that you're vetting them appropriately and looking for specific documentation from them on how they secure their data and what type of information they can provide to you in that way.
Great. We may have time here for a couple more questions. How do you measure, what are some thoughts on how do you measure productivity in a results-only work environment, and specifically maybe for an hourly employee that's working remotely?
That can be complicated. And like I said earlier, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all type of thing. I'll use an example from our viewpoint. When we had interns, we would pay them hourly and they weren't working at an office, but we had a certain type of work that we needed for them to get done. So we would say, okay, we have XYZ tasks for you to do. You need to have this completed, within by this date, and this should only take you 3 to 4 hours work. And there is some type of trust part there. Obviously, it does come down to trust, where you're making sure that they're reporting in exactly how long they've worked. But it is easy for you to assign a task that you know for a fact which should only take them an hour. And then if it takes them 3 or 4 hours to do so, you have a conversation with them about that. And then if it's something that's reoccurring, you can investigate it further, because again, it's not going to work if you can't trust that your employee is adequately representing how long they're working. So there's different things that you can take into consideration there. To be honest with you, we've kind of taken all of those roles and essentially automated them at this point. So a lot of the work that we do now is basically just it's based on a deliverable, making sure that you're done with a certain process by XYZ date. So like I said, there's different challenges you have to face and overcome, and there's not necessarily one right or wrong way to do it.
No, that's great. Thomas, real quick, the last question here before we close. I think this will be quick. You mentioned remote work is strewn with failure. What maybe is different this time around in
I think a
2020?
lot of the concerns around it were maybe just a lack of involvement with management and leadership. Maybe there wasn't the best idea, that maybe not everybody was on board. I also think the technology has changed a lot. I mean, if we look at just the past 10 years, there's been a proliferation of better broadband internet connections across all of our, personal lives. I mean, everybody can stream 4K video at the drop of a hat, and that's an incredible amount of bandwidth that these internet service providers are having to provide. But we now just have better tools in place that work great and just facilitate an easier interaction. And I think that that's probably part of it as well. There's better buy-in from management, especially now that we understand it kind of has to be that way. We don't have a choice, and just being able to have good devices and better technology in our pocket to be able to facilitate that has been helpful. I mean, like I said, 10 years ago, the iPhone had just come out. It was 2 or 3 years old at that point. And that idea of everybody having a smartphone in their pocket was crazy. I mean, I remember being in college and I had email on my phone and nobody had email on their phone. That was something that wasn't widespread like it is today. So I definitely think that has played a big part in it. And it would have been much more challenging if something like this had happened in the year 1999 or 2000.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Well, Thomas, thanks again for today. And I just have a couple closing important announcements here before we wrap up today's webinar. First, we're excited to announce that our next free webinar is next week on Tuesday, only a few days away. It's called What the Presidential Transition Means for Religious Ministries. We're pleased to welcome Amy Vitale of Beckett Law to guide us through policy agendas, how the landscape might shift, and what the impact might be on religious organizations. And also, while I have this opportunity, I want to just say a very sincere thank you to many of our over 2,500 ECFA members represented on today's webinar. For other friends who are also with us today, now is a great time to take the next step in becoming ECFA accredited. In these days, where there's so much uncertainty, we know givers are looking for ministries of the highest integrity they can trust to steward their resources and see the kingdom advance. During this COVID-19 season, ECFA is waiving the standard initial $500 application fee. To learn more about this opportunity, you can email Nicole directly at nicole@ecfa.org. Well, that brings us to the end of today's ECFA webinar on managing a remote team securely and effectively. Again, I'd like to thank Thomas Tyler for his outstanding presentation and insights, and for each person who joined us today for this webinar. God bless you all as you continue to shine bright the light of Jesus Christ in these times.